I am a single mother living in my house with 2 children and my mother. The town we live in always had a calm and peaceful atmosphere. One day, the townspeople were discussing the new priest who would be coming to the church. They said that the priest is 60 years old and will stay in the vacant house next to the church. Everyone was curious about the priest. I took my 2 children and went to the church. There was a large crowd and curious eyes. People were whispering and saying things quietly. I couldn't understand what was being said as we awaited the introduction to the new priest, unaware of the events that would unfold. The priest arrived, and as he greeted everyone, something caught my attention. The priest looked not 60 but more like 30. His hair was jet black, his skin smooth, and he had a long, thin beard on his chin. There was a mysterious and unsettling aura in the priest's gaze that I couldn't comprehend. After the introduction ceremony, the townspeople wanted to help the priest settle into the house, but he expressed that it was unnecessary in a hesitant and somewhat angry manner. Everyone was surprised, but they couldn't make sense of the priest's behavior. I took my children home. My mother had prepared dinner. While eating, I told her about the priest's strange behavior, and she was equally surprised and curious about the reason behind it. Soon, we understood the cause of this situation. While my children were playing in the yard, they heard a crying sound on the street and rushed outside. The sounds were coming from the direction of the church. When my children approached the house next to the church, the sounds stopped, and they returned home. In the evening, they told me about this incident, and I warned them not to go out without permission. The matter closed, but my curiosity grew even more. One day I went to the garden to do some gardening. I cleaned and watered the flower beds. Just as I was about to go inside, a crack in the garden gate caught my attention. While inspecting the gate, I suddenly heard a crying sound. This sound was very different from the ones I had heard before. It started like a child's voice and eventually turned into the crying of an old person. My hair stood on end, and I started walking towards the direction of the sound. I could hear the beating of my heart. Finally, I got very close to the sounds and, when I looked, I realized that the sounds were coming from the house next to the church. I was terrified and ran away from there. I told a few friends in town about this incident, and everyone was very surprised. They said they had experienced the same thing and were very curious about what was happening. What was even more interesting was that the sounds were always heard at the same time, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We talked with my friends and decided to go to the priest's house at the time when the cries were heard and find out the truth. The next day, we gathered on the street where the church was, waiting for the sounds. Once again, cries started coming from the priest's house, a child's voice followed by a young man's voice and then an adult's. When an adult cry was heard, we all entered the priest's house together and were stunned by what we saw. The priest was sitting in the middle of the living room surrounded by incense and candles. In front of him was a painting made up of symbols we couldn't understand. The curtains were closed, and it was dark inside. The priest's hands and face were covered in blood. Suddenly, he turned around and saw us. We tried to escape through the door, but we couldn't open it. The priest walked towards us, but we couldn't recognize his face. The person in front of us seemed to be someone else. He asked us, "Why?" and then suddenly fainted. Everyone started to panic, and since the door wouldn't open, we decided to jump out of the window. Once outside, we immediately called a hospital and reported that the priest had fainted. The police and an ambulance arrived, broke the door to enter the house. Inside, there were only candles, incense, and the incomprehensible painting. They searched the entire house but couldn't find the priest. Since that day, no one has seen the priest. Later, we heard that the priest was actually 60 years old. His youthful appearance was the result of a spell. Through daily rituals and ceremonies, he could stay young. First, he turned into a baby and then ultimately into a 30-year-old adult. We, unintentionally, disrupted the spell by being there during the ritual, and it completely destroyed the priest. After hearing this story, I shuddered and felt a sense of sorrow, thinking that we had harmed the priest.